to Relationally Speaking. And today I'm going to be taking you on a little trip back to my grad school days. And okay, I'm just going to set the scene for this. I want you to imagine me as a little baby therapist, wide eyed, eager. And I'm at this moment so ready to fix everything and everyone, which bless her heart, she had so much to learn. We have a lot of compassion for her. But one of my first couples ever. We're going to call them Sarah and Jake for confidentiality purpose. They walked into my office and I could see that they were already carrying so much weight, like, ugh, like you could feel it when they walked into the room. The way they put it, Jake wanted more sex and Sarah wanted less sex. Jake felt rejected and unloved, and then Sarah felt pressured and misunderstood. And it wasn't that it was just about sex. So the sex was kind of the thing that was very tangible and easy to understand, but it was spilling into every other part of the relationship, and they were just feeling very stuck. Of course, back then I thought, okay, I've got this. I'm just going to solve this problem. Typical math equation. I was very much into solution focused at the time, and scaling questions are very big in solution focused therapy. So little baby therapist me is like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is sex to you? And I'm like, write down the numbers. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you? Because of course I was convinced that I would find this magic number, the perfect middle ground that they could compromise on, because, that's like what you hear. Relationships are a compromise and you kind of got to work your way through that. So, of course, I thought sex and frequency of sex would be a thing that they'd compromise on and that they'd just be walking out of this session happy and I'd be a success. Which, of course, crash and burn. I'm so grateful for our training program because they had these double-sided mirror rooms where there was a supervisor, and then we had a whole team of other therapists that are looking into your session, which is intimidating, but also really, really good because then you get all these great suggestions. And sometimes when you're really making a mess of things, you'd get a phone call and they'd call and be like, okay, well, maybe you want to try and do this, which at the moment I didn't get a phone call, but yeah, they had some feedback for me. I came back into their room because no duh, intimacy issues are not scaling questions and there is no real middle ground or magic number that you can compromise because that's never going to make anyone happy. And it's usually about the connection and all these other layers. And of course, later on, I would continue my work with Jake and Sarah, which again, bless them for sticking through this and sticking with me. But we would later find out that Jake needed physical intimacy to feel emotionally close, and Sarah needed emotional closeness to feel physically open. But yeah, I was there trying to tackle unmet needs and unspoken fears with numbers. So that's kind of where we're starting today. And if you haven't already guessed it, we're talking about mismatched sexual desire. And if you've ever felt like Sarah or Jake, you're not alone. And hopefully you do not have a newbie therapist. But if you do, be gentle with them. They will figure themselves out. Nicole, I want to hear from you and I want to know if you've ever had a Jake and Sarah couple or the equivalent of this. And then, of course, any stories that you have about you being a little baby sex therapist and, anything that you would want to share on that end.
Absolutely. First of all, that is just I think anybody who is new into the field and this baby therapist is we are going to get cases handed to us where we don't know what the heck to do, but we're trying our best and we're showing up so fully and we have these amazing supervisors helping us. But yeah, we're going to get handed sex cases every now and then, and school doesn't so fully teach that, or at least it didn't back when I was in grad school. Now there's so much info and so much education around it. But back then, yeah, I had a Jake and Sarah, and my version of your scaling question, because I did used to use those too, but mine at the time sounded something like, so if your sex was perfect, what would sex look like for you? Which was no good, right? Like, no bueno. We don't ask that question right off the bat. Sure, at a certain point, we might ask that question, right? Like, hey, if you could kind of like paint me a picture of what the sex is that you want. That's a pretty normal question to ask at some point in couples therapy. But I think at first, starting there, it was just reiterating that very issue that they were coming to me with, that sex wasn't happening. So it was
Mm.
very far off from perfect. And so they couldn't even imagine what perfect sex was because they weren't having it. It didn't exist. And the word perfect as well is problematic, right? Because there's no such thing as perfect sex. So, with you, I've had my fair share of kind of blips and mistakes in therapy as a therapist. But you bring up something really important here, and that is there are these unmet needs underneath the want for quote unquote more sex that we often fail to really communicate about, right? So for this couple, right, the Jake and Sarah you were working with, it was one of them needing sex to feel close and the other one needing emotional connection to then feel open. But in general, desire discrepancy, right, this mismatched desire is actually one of the most common reasons I think couples see me in my work as a sex therapist. But of course, they don't really use that language like desire discrepancy. They're not putting that in their paperwork. Instead, in a particular case I've worked with, it sounded something along the lines of I want our sex to be more fun. I want it to be more explorative. I want to try new things. And long pause, she doesn't. She wants to keep it familiar. She wants to keep sex the same, right? So it's not always a discrepancy. Like with Jake and Sarah, it was around frequency. But with this couple, it was the type of sex, right? What like we wanted the sex to offer us in the relationship was what was different between the couple I was working with, right? So the more she felt like sex she wasn't providing wasn't good enough, wasn't sufficient, right? When he came and said, I want to try new things, that elicited in her of like, am I not good enough then? Is the sex we're currently having not what you want? And so she shut down, right? Like obviously she withdrew and she not only didn't want new sex that he was trying to bring to the table, but actually began to resent the sex they were previously having too,
Oh,
right? And for him in this scenario, he felt pretty defeated. He felt rejected. He felt like too much for wanting something different sexually, right? Kind of the thought of, is this what it's going to look like and feel like forever in my relationship? And he kind of surrendered to that thought.
that sounds awful
Yeah.
thinking about that. Like, is this
Yeah.
real life? You remember that little kid meme?
Yeah.
And feeling like, is this it? Like, is this what it's going to look like forever? Is this what our relationship has now become? And do I just surrender to, this fact, which is never what we want to be feeling because that sense of helplessness or hopelessness is never good. But I love how you brought this up because we often focus on the number when it comes to
Mhm.
desire mismatch or desire discrepancies. I don't think we talk very often about the type of sex that we are having. And maybe we didn't even know that we could talk about the type of sex because we've been so number centric in terms of the conversations that we have about sex. And obviously in, the example that you shared, it's so clear how quickly things grow when partners aren't on the same page about what they want their sexual connection to look or feel like. And I think that his desire for different sex wasn't just like novelty or, the sense of newness, but it's tied to this very deep
Mhm.
human need for excitement or maybe affirmation
Yes.
from your partner. And then for her, the familiar vanilla consistent sex
Yeah.
maybe gave her a sense of safety or grounding. And maybe that's something that she's never really experienced in her life. And so there's a deep need for safety and grounding. And duh, we know that both of these are valid, but I can see how easy it is to not see it that way. And that is hard to understand. Um, yeah, I think we miss that part. That it's not about also making someone wrong about what they want. So for him wanting that excitement or for her wanting that vanilla sex, but creating space for both of these partners to feel seen and heard and respected. And yet it takes a lot of vulnerability to be able to have this conversation and to unpack the fears and these insecurities that are driving these preferences. I can also understand why we're not getting to that deeper conversation because that is a very vulnerable place to go.
For sure. And even as you said, like echoed back almost with this couple needs, one of them more of this excitement, this sense of exploration with his partner, because he does feel so safe with her. So he's able to go there and wants to go there. And her need for safety and security and groundedness is, it reminds me of something Esther Perel would say, is that those two things live in constant kind of, they coexist. They have to live alongside each other. The need for security has to be matched with the need for novelty. The need for excitement and exploration has to be met with the need for groundedness. We can't have one without also having the other. And say that they were coming into my space almost posing each other as the problem, when I'm sitting there thinking, man, y'all actually really need each other, because you have more of what he actually needs,
Mhm.
and you have more of what she actually needs and can't access as fully. Anyways, we eventually got there. But I hear you that, vulnerability, especially around something that we have been taught we shouldn't be talking about, or something that shouldn't come up in a good relationship, is really scary. And in a case similar to this one, it again was less about the frequency, right? The number of times we're having sex per week, and more about the discrepancy between what both partners felt sex represented in the relationship. So essentially, what was the role of sex? What was the function of sex? For him, it was a way to connect and to feel close. And it was something really sacred and special to share with his partner. And for her, it was a way to maintain the relationship, especially so long as both of them orgasmed. So, very different functions. His more about relational connection, hers was actually more pleasure oriented. And neither, again, is right or wrong. There are so many functions of sex, but you could see where they could kind of butt up against each other, right? Where the person looking for connection, if he walks into the space and feels like, my partner only wants to orgasm today, but I actually really want to feel close, whether or not orgasm even happens, is we're again in that we're right smack dab in that discrepancy, right? And that function we attach to sex actually does impact how often we want it or don't want it. So in this case, if I only want sex to orgasm, right? That's my function of sex and to maintain the relationship. I'd imagine it starts to feel a little bit like dutiful, like a little bit obligatory, a little bit pressure filled, right? So how could we possibly want to even have sex when it's just a checkbox to fill,
Mm,
right?
yeah, and not just a checkbox, but sometimes there's a lot of pressure on that, because I think
Yeah.
the more that you think about having an orgasm, the less likely that you probably are to have an orgasm.
Where are you, orgasm? Well, it's long gone now.
Oh my gosh, you get in your head and then you're just like in this performance anxiety, and then you're like, "Okay, I've lost it." But no, like keep going.
Yeah.
So that's such that's a pickle, friend. That is a pickle to me. But yeah,
Yeah.
what sex represents in a relationship is so central. I mean, like you're saying, if the sex is tied to connection and emotional intimacy for one person, but the other it's tied to obligation, that is such a disconnect. It's kind of like you're speaking two different languages about what it means, and you're going into it and you're like not understanding each other whatsoever. Here you've got someone who's trying to be sensual and sexual and connect, and the other's like bang, bang, bong, like let's make sure that we get our orgasm and we finish. Um, yeah, like those are two very different feelings, and I don't think that continuing to do the same thing and not have a conversation about it, like I don't know how you would even get to the bottom of understanding the desire component of it. I mean, if you don't get to that, then it's very easy to shut down and to, I don't know, I feel like just so many things could go wrong. Like I'm like having the scenario play out as you're telling me about the couple, and it just feels like a lot. And then, of course, the story that we tell ourselves about what's happening. Well, now you're too much, or you're asking for too much, or you're being unreasonable, or you're even internalizing that yourself and thinking that there's no hope, and that all of the things that we go down, like definitely the rabbit hole. So that's tricky. And I think that we can all start slowing down before we go down the rabbit hole and starting to ask ourselves and our partners this really big question, which is, what does sex mean to me? What does it mean to my partner? And then creating a space where those conversations and the answers to the question can exist without judgment. And think that when we can reframe it as an opportunity to learn about each other rather than this problem to solve with the checklist and the check mark and, you know, the compromise and the magic number in the middle. Well, I think that that's when things really start to shift. And of course, what I wish I would have shared with poor Jake and Sarah in our first session, we figured it out. Again, we did get there. But I think, again, this idea of what does sex mean to me? What kind of sex do I want to be having? What kind of sex does my partner want to be having? So these are all really big questions that aren't yes, no, number A, B, C, or D. These are like these open-ended, please write your answer in the space that has been below. Like those are the kind of
I
conversations.
hate those.
Yeah. These are the kind of conversations that we want to be having for sure.
It really is, I think, again, when we think about desire discrepancy, and for the sake of today's episode, it is so much more than just get on my page or I'm going to get on yours.
Mm.
Right? I think that's so often, I mean, to your point with the scaling questions and trying to find this beautiful compromise, is it doesn't always work out like that so seamlessly, hardly ever truly, because there's so many more things at play, emotional undertones to the surface issue of we're not having sex, or they want more sex, I want less sex. Is our relationship essentially incompatible? In some cases, perhaps. In many cases that I've worked with, no, absolutely not. There's a lot we can work with. But I think when we're talking about desire discrepancy, we have to zoom out. And instead of pinning one partner as the bad guy and the other person as the good guy, it is the meaning we attach to this desire discrepancy, like you said, that really, that's the thing we're talking about. Is what does it mean that you two are not on the same page? What does it mean that one of you wants more sex and the other wants less sex?
Mhm.
That's where we have to start, and it's this idea, at least for me, like thinking about misconceptions around resolving this, I suppose, is in the session space, partners usually want this very quick and immediate solution, which makes sense. At that point, maybe they haven't had sex for months or years. I've certainly run into that 5 years plus without sex. And so they enter into my space truly desperate. We want a solution. Tell us what we should do. Right. And the higher desire partner often feels like they need to want less sex, and the lower desire partner often feels a sense of pressure to want sex more. And I wish I could say it was that simplistic, right? So, misconception number one is we think there is this quick solution, have more sex, to a much larger, very complex dynamic at play. So, again, we need to kind of zoom out from the issue that's being talked about and actually look at what's happening between and within both partners as a result of these differing sexual desires, right? So, higher desire partner usually feels lonely, rejected. I'm tired of initiating. I'm disappointed. I feel defeated. Lower desire partner usually ends up feeling insufficient for their partner, pressured, overwhelmed, and that can look like ending up avoiding sex altogether and even their partner's non sexual touch. So now we're not only withdrawing from sex, but we might not even want to get close to our partner because it might lead to sex. So I would never give this prescriptive advice to my clients to go have sex X times a week, right? Because that's outcome based sexuality. It doesn't really address the core issue that they're coming in for. And instead, I think it's about reassociating touch, so non sexual touch, with something both partners can be really open to and enjoy. So maybe it is that their lower desired partner hugs them and offers them a kiss and initiates a kiss, which makes the higher desire partner feel more wanted and more desired. And this hug or this kiss might make the lower desire partner remove the pressure that this touch must lead to sex. Instead, it's just about the kiss. And it's just about what the kiss offers in terms of reconnecting emotionally. And obviously, conversations about the sex they were previously happening and how it evolved and how they want to see it change comes next. But I really think, again, it's not going to be this prescriptive go have more sex. It's going to be like, oof, let's slow down and start from the beginning here and start to reframe what touch can actually look like for the two of you.
And as you are saying that, I'm thinking about those that come in and they're like, well, I know that when they like start rubbing my back or when they start patting me, like I know that what they want is to have sex, right? Some
The
are
pat, not the
the
pat. Literally anything but the pat or like the little like shoulder rub. Get your hand off my shoulder.
oh my gosh, the pat in the shoulder. I've heard of it so many times. And it is one of those things where it's just like, hey, and some course partners are like, no, like I know what the pat means. Like the pat isn't just a pat. Like you're not just being kind and thoughtful and you're not just wanting to like rub my back. You are expecting the pat to be your little approach and your little entrance into sex. I think it's so important to kind of desensitize ourselves and reset these neural pathways around the pat and around this touch without any expectation that it's going to lead to something.
Yes, that it's just touch for the sake of touch versus here is my pat to invite you into the sex that you actually didn't want and
Yeah.
now feel like you must go into. So, yes, reassociating the pat with just nice touch.
Yeah, yeah, we start there. But I also think that what makes it really challenging is that, going back to your idea of this quick fix, I think some of that comes from, of course, this really big place of discomfort, which is we are tired of dealing with this issue. We're stuck in the tension. We're stuck here in this discomfort. And exploring what's going on, like that can be very unbearable. Almost like I'm wondering if sometimes we push for these quick solutions because we want to avoid these hard, vulnerable conversations. We know it's much easier to say, all right, I'll just meet you in the middle, or fine, I will try my best to want more than it is to say, here's why this is hard for me, or here's what I'm afraid of. And I kind of want to share that this is the type of sex that I want to be having. But if I share that with you, what are you going to think about me? And, is there going to be a judgment from that? So that's a really hard conversation to have over the fine, okay, I will just be here. I will show up for the sex. Um,
How fun.
how fun. And, like thinking back to Jake and Sarah, we had that conversation and, those would have just been band-aid conversations. Sure, meet somewhere in the middle, but we wouldn't have figured out that Jake wasn't just asking for more sex. He was asking for a way to feel closer to Sarah or to feel wanted. And Sarah wasn't just avoiding sex. She was avoiding the overwhelming pressure that she felt to meet this expectation that really began to feel impossible. But they didn't want to tell each other that. Like they did not want to have that hard conversation. And they were just both caught in this loop of reacting to each other's wounds. Again, the sense of the wound of rejection for him, and then the wound of expectation. And then they would just keep going around in circles. And, this kind of goes back also to what you mentioned, which is outcome based sex or outcome based sexuality. And in case, I don't know if we mentioned it earlier on, I just want to make sure that we give it like a little bit of a definition. And that's when we focus sex or our sexuality on the end result. How often it happens, if there was an orgasm, or even just checking that box to say we did it, like the checking box. There's a huge problem, obviously, with outcome based sexuality. Again, it creates more pressure and disconnection, and we shift the focus away from this shared experience and connection, and it turns sex into a task instead of this intimate moment that you can have. And I think that when we step away from that outcome based mindset and we start exploring what sex represents for each partner, it opens up a whole new conversation. Very different conversation again for Jake and Sarah. For Jake, it might have meant sharing how much he craves, feeling desired and wanted, which is, like a hard thing to say. Like, I want you to want me. I want you to desire me. That's hard. And I get it, but that's that's an important conversation to have. And for Sarah, it might have meant explaining or expressing the overwhelm and these unspoken expectations around sex. So, yeah, outcome based, frequency, performance, you're not going to get anywhere with that. You're not going to get to the heart of what's driving the real desires, the real fears, and the real connection.
Thank you so much for giving that kind of double click on outcome based sex. Because, yeah, I think anytime, truly with anything in life, not just sex, but if we are so outcome focused, the disappointment we feel when we don't reach that outcome with sex, it's not going to happen every time because we're going to have clunky sex and awkward sex and subpar sex. And so if we're solely outcome focused, we're
Yeah.
surely going to feel disappointed, and disappointment might feel like shame, and shame leads typically to more avoidance and withdrawal. And so then we're again kind of in this place where sex becomes scary. When instead, can we refocus on connection and getting to know ourselves simultaneously as we're getting to know our partner within the sex we are or are hoping to have again? And another little double click on the it's not always we're avoiding the sex itself, like the act of sex. Like some of these partners come in it and they tell me, like, I know how to have the sex, like, I know what to do with my body. Like, that's not the issue. They're avoiding the emotion that has now been attached to sex
Oh,
as I'm about to be seen and I haven't been seen by my partner for so long. And I'm avoiding that, not the sex, not the action of our bodies against each other, but of being seen. Or I'm avoiding the discomfort of another vulnerable emotion. So I think that is just so important to name that it's not just the sex, the physical act, but we're often avoiding the emotional association with sex, especially when it's held baggage over the years, or especially when it has held ruptures in the relationship where there's been pain points within sex. That's what we're avoiding. That sex felt like rejection the last time I had it with you. And so why would I want to have it again? Right. So another thing we commonly hear though is that this higher desire partner is the healthier one, the more normal one, because essentially, like, we do get that kind of exhibited in society, right? That like you should want sex. And if you're in a relationship, it should be happening. And here's how often. And yes, that is a healthy relationship. And then the lower desire partner is obviously put into the blame category of you're the reason why we're not having sex. So it fails to recognize that this is truly a dynamic. Both partners are co creating a system that either allows sex to happen or makes sex feel a little bit less accessible. This is not a one partner did this to us. This is a both of us have contributed to this desire discrepancy that we're currently confronting. And neither partner is at fault for their own level of desire. It's influenced by so many different things, which we'll talk a little bit about today. But it's, yeah, putting a partner in a blame category is surely not going to make them want sex more.
oh my gosh, no. Kind of like when you go into therapy and one partner comes in and they're like, fix them, right? Like, fix them. Like, they're the
Uh
one
huh.
with the problem. Like, I'm
Yeah.
fine. Of course, we know that it's the dynamic and the things that are going on. And I was just thinking about the study that, you know, ages and ages ago. There was actually a study that found that the quote unquote average couple has sex about once a week. So that stat gets thrown around a lot. But here's the kicker. So when researchers asked these couples to double their weekly frequency, their happiness levels did not increase. If you're having like sex once a week, we're asking you to have sex twice a week. And if you're having twice a week to, I guess, four or whatever, like any sort of increase, right? Like
Mhm.
they're making you increase the sex, which should make you happier. That's not actually what happened. Their happiness levels actually went down. And
So interesting.
and so that just makes me think, yeah, like, in the moment, I'm like, "Really? Like, that doesn't make any sense." And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, of course it does." Because then sex becomes this chore, and it becomes something that they have to do. It becomes another homework assignment,
Mhm.
this number, and not because we actually genuinely want to have sex or to genuinely connect with our partners. So, more sex does not equal, quote unquote, an increase in happiness. It doesn't mean that, yes, we will be a better couple or in a better partnership. So yeah, I just thought that was really interesting to kind of see that having more sex in and of itself is not the solution. It actually might fail and have the opposite impact.
Oh, I love that you shared that. I think that's a study that is worth putting in the show notes because I think that really, right? Like it would just, I think there is this misconception that more equals better. I think in every kind of aspect of life, unfortunately. But yeah, then it becomes this task, this to do, this thing that we must have for this outcome of happiness. Again, that's even outcome based sex. Have
Mhm.
more to equal greater happiness versus, hey, let's actually decide of that one time a week you're having it or that one time a month you're having it, well, what do you want that one time to look at versus just have more of the same kind you're having,
Yeah. And
right?
saying that having more is the healthy thing to do, right? Because we're going back to
Right.
the idea of the normal partner is the one that wants to have more sex or has a higher sexual desire. So kind of equating that to the health of the relationship or having more is more healthy. Like that's not it. I think whatsoever. Of course, it also puts the lower desire partner in this fix it label. Like fix yourself or I have to fix, like I am broken and I'm the
Mm,
one, kind of needs to deal with this, which I could just imagine. And I've seen it. Actually, I don't have to imagine it. It definitely needs to shut and avoidant.
yeah.
Who wants to think about things when they're broken, right? Like, I don't want to be like, okay, I'm broken and I'm going to go like figure out what to do next. Now I'm broken and I'm going to go sit in a
It's not
corner.
motivating.
No, it's not motivating.
No.
Definitely not a thing that we need to fix. And I love how you said earlier that so much of this is about reassociating touch and rebuilding connections in ways that don't always lead to sex or the rewiring of the pad.
Mhm.
Sometimes just that hug or that kiss or holding hands and letting those moments be enough. Like that is great. That's connection. That's sure is removed and desire has more room to grow naturally. It's like not manufactured. We're not putting on a show. And you end up actually wanting or
Mhm.
raping the other person. Um,
Mhm.
know that we've already been kind of like layering this into our conversation, Nicole, but with all of the things that we've talked about and, we've kind of given little snippets of things, but I kind of want to properly break it. Like, what do we do? And how do we actually have these meaningful conversations that we need? How do we remove the outcome based and essentially what is next? Like, break it down.
Yeah. I think the first thing I would offer to any couple, or what I do offer, I should say, is normalizing these natural fluctuations in desire over the course of truly any relationship. And I always say that just because this is common and we're naming this as normal doesn't make it feel any easier at first because you are still going to bed with that person with that elephant in the room of we're not having sex. So I know it's still hard, even though it's common. But I truly have never worked with a couple who didn't experience like some level of shift or ebbs and flows within their sex life, which makes sense, right? Because who we are at the start of the relationship and what sex meant in the beginning, which is very frequent and is this lusty, high energy, adrenaline producing thing is bound to change, right? So sexual desire is not static. And quoting Esther Perel, I love this quote, is desire matures over time, just like we do. What turns you on in your 20s may not in your 50s, and that's perfectly normal, right? So, how can we possibly be wishing and hoping and trying to mold ourselves back into our 20s when we are at a completely different life stage and sex has taken a different form? And so not only am I normalizing these ebbs and flows, I'm also detaching this idea that sexual frequency is a reliable source of measuring the health of a relationship because it's not, especially because, again, we know it changes because we change. And that can instead we get curious about what we want in our 30s or 40s or 50s versus telling ourselves we must want what we used to have in our 20s, right? So instead of pigeonholing ourselves into that, can we get really excited about the fact that maybe there's something different now at this stage in my life that I haven't yet named? So that's kind of where I start. A lot of normalization that this is bound to happen in your relationship, if not currently, but at some point. And it's okay. It's hard
Yeah.
and it's okay.
Yeah. The sex that I was having in my 20s is definitely not the sex that
So
I would
different.
so different. And I'm really grateful for that because one, I was not aware of what I wanted whatsoever. It wasn't really a thought. I don't think I thought about, oh, here is my pleasure and here is my desire and here are the things that I want. So I am actually really grateful that I am being 20s sex in my almost 40 body. I'm so grateful for that.
I feel that my 20-year-old sex was pretty mindless and numb and checked out and just male oriented, just for him, not for me. So thank goodness I allowed myself to evolve. But I think having the conversation too, to understand one another's meaning associated with sex. So coming back to that conversation around function, the role we want it to play, and another conversation around the quality of sex you're having versus the quantity.
Yeah,
So, do you even enjoy the sex you're having? What could make it more satisfying, right? Because it makes a lot of sense. You're not going to feel a lot of desire for sex if you describe it as unsatisfying, mediocre, subpar. So instead of just having more unenjoyable sex, we want to first address what would make it better. What would make you actually want it, right? What is like sex worth having? And what does that look like?
I love that. And I think that, thinking about the sex that is worth having, that really just makes me think about this idea of gas and breaks. I know that you and I have talked about it, but I just want to introduce it to everyone
Mhm.
listening. And this is this concept. I first came across it in Emily Nagoski's book, Come As You Are. I'm not sure if she's the one that originally coined that. You might know a little bit more about that. Such a good read. So she does an incredible job of breaking it down. And the idea is that our sexual desire operates like this dual control system. So think of a car, and we obviously have the gas pedal and then the brake pedal. The gas gets things going. These are the things that turn us on, spark the sense of desire. We feel connected, relaxed, or, we're just feeling like we're in this stimulated environment. And then contrast the brakes are the things that inhibit desire. So think things like stress, exhaustion, body image, and feeling kind of yucky in your body, a sense of feeling pressured, which is funny because that's what we've been talking about this whole time. So, the pressure around the sex is definitely going to hit the brakes. And the other thing is that for many people, it's not just about pressing the gas harder. So, like, more things that excite me, more things that are like fun and sparking desire. It's a lot about understanding what's hitting the brakes because it's really hard to come back from the brakes versus like once you get this thing going. Thinking back to like Sarah and Jake, and once we identified their gas and brakes, the conversation shifted. It wasn't about fixing one of them. It was about making sure that they helped each other and understood how their context shaped their desire and what they could do to create a more supportive dynamic. So it became this whole I love when couples go into this, well, we're on the same team and we're going to beat this, thing together. And that's exactly what happened. Like they really got on board about making sure they understood each other's breaks and gas and breaks and kind of coming up with this teamwork effort, which I loved. And that was so much fun. But yeah, a lot of this, what you're talking about, it just goes into this idea of removing the unnecessary pressure, creating space for the gas pedal to engage naturally. Again, I recommend anyone who hasn't read this book, if you're curious, it's a game changer. Definitely check it out.
This idea, that you're really getting at here is understanding. So, another conversation that we're having in the therapy space is understanding one another's brakes and gas pedals, right? It allows you both to essentially like co create. That's another kind of Emily Nagoski concept. Let's co create a system that allows you to release the brake and maybe push a little bit harder on that gas pedal, right? So, we need to be talking about my individual gas pedals and my individual brakes, right? Because that really does break down judgment around who's the healthier partner, who's the more normal partner when it comes to sexual desire, and instead just contextualizes it. Right. So when I say contextualizes, and like when you use the word context, we're really getting at like it would make sense that our partner has lower desire on work nights after we learn that exhaustion and being tapped out emotionally all day creates a lot of distance between them and desire, right? It would make sense that our partner might have a really high desire for sex after a date night once we learn that connecting emotionally and playful conversations are actually a really big accelerator for them. So that's what we mean when we say it contextualizes. It's the making sense of, oh, like that makes sense you don't want sex right now. The place is a mess. Our home is a mess. There's clothes on the floor. Or, wow, it makes sense that you want sex after we just had a really fun day of trying something new together. And now you're in a place where you're really open to connecting in bed, not just outside of the bedroom, right? So when we don't talk openly about these brakes and these gas pedals, you'll probably make some pretty inaccurate assumptions about what's going on in your relationship, right? So we might look at our partner's lack of desire as disinterest or rejection, but it might be just an overloaded brake system, right? Which is pushed really hard because of stress and overwhelm or parenting or work, right? But instead of assuming you don't want me, we can open up and look at the context of that's right. You have a really hard time accessing sex when your brain is in the emails that have been piled for days that you have to respond to.
Yeah. And that sounds like really robotic, like, oh, that's right. You have a really hard time accessing. Like, it sounds different. It's
It plays out differently.
kind of like I remember that you get super stressed out when you are in your emails and your brain is still in work mode, right? So there's very much a different thought that comes about when we're making it make sense. It's not about me. You're not rejecting me. It's your head is elsewhere and breaks because you're not even present. Like, you're not even here.
Yeah.
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 I kind of want to know some of your gas and your brake pedals, Nicole. What are yours? Like, I'm like genuinely curious now.
A pretty sensitive gas pedal. Most things get me pushing it, but for me specifically, vulnerable conversations. So when we feel emotionally safe with each other, when we do something playful, that could be tossing a ball outside. I don't know. I don't know when we last did that.
Nothing
Uh,
about. Oh, I'm so turned on.
trying something new together. My gas pedal is definitely going to be pushed. Another is when I'm feeling confident. Like
Yeah.
it's actually when we've had kind of a little bit of space to do our own thing. So I might take a workout class or might get my hair done or I might go do art by myself. And I come back into our relationship with a lot of desire for sex. Whereas on the other hand, conflict pushes my brakes, which is interesting because it doesn't necessarily push my partners. For me, I can't seem to enter into anything remotely intimate coming out of conflict. I usually feel pretty exhausted and flooded. So, for some, conflict is a way to reconnect. For me, sex would feel so empty after conflict. I wouldn't be totally present. I need emotional closeness before going into sex. What about you?
Let's see. So, gas, lazy Sunday mornings where you don't have anything to do. So there's like no plans. Don't have anywhere you need to go, anywhere you need to be. So you're present. The TV is off and you're just like laying in bed having little chit chat conversations. That is such like, ta-da, we've like created a little environment for like the best kind of things. And that really gets me in the headspace of there's no pressure, present, we're connected, we're here. Also touch, very much like a little massage, not the pad. Like the pad is definitely it.
Not the fat.
the pat, but like sensual, kind of touching, gentle, like anything sensory. I love
Mm.
into the sensory. Break. I feel like oh my God. So anytime we're going in one direction, and so it's like, oh, like I brought something up and that feels fun and playful. And then they like bring you back down to earth, like, oh, okay, that's cool. So what's for dinner? And you're just like, what?
Just trying to connect with you.
Like I'm having this little flow moment, and you've literally just like it does actually feel like you've just hit the brakes on this thing and on this flow. Or like when you're starting things off and you're kind of like getting in the mood, and they're like, oh, okay, well, maybe we should do this one thing before we get started. And you're just like, no, 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 no. Like, we're like, we do this and we're done.
Yeah.
Go off the beaten path and we're not going to go there. And like, I understand that some brains are like, for this to happen, A must happen first, right? So there's like this sequence of events, and that is like big break system for me.
Feels like an interruption.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
is an
no, it
interruption.
really is. But then
Yeah.
like, F it, like we're no, that was, and then I get a little petty about it, where I'm like, that was your chance, and now we're no, I know that that's not helpful either, but whatever. That's
But
me.
hey, I feel that. I've been there. I get
Mm,
it.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
like,
yeah.
wait a second, you have me in the bed with you. Take
Mhm,
it
mhm.
because I won't be here later,
Yeah, that's
asshole.
and you should be so lucky. You should be so
I'm sure though, as we are talking about some of these things, maybe some listeners are saying, but wait, like I don't know what gets me in a place to want sex. And I don't know what are the things that get me out of a place of wanting sex. And quite frankly, I don't even know what I like or what I don't like. I don't know what it is that I desire, what feels good or not so good. And that is such a key component to this conversation as well. Both like in individual therapy, we work on that, certainly bringing your partner into the conversation. But it makes sense that like you might not desire sex if you don't know quite what it is you even desire.
yeah, like
Um,
me in my 20s, and I had no idea. I think this brings up this great conversation for our next episode, which is on the desire blueprint and kind of creating pathway for desire, figuring out what it is that you enjoy, what it is that are these breaks and pedals for yourself and for your partner. I mean, we're going to get started with you because obviously, like, that's the foundation and all of those things. And then what, but that's probably a conversation that's hard for many of us who haven't really owned their sex or their sexuality or known that it could even be theirs to begin with.
for next week's episode, all about the desire blueprint.
See you then.